Hey guys, welcome to this short video where I'm going to attempt to explain how variable arguments or varargs work in C. So those of you who have been following my channel know that I'm working on my own programming language called C, like that C, not the letter C. Yeah, I'm sorry that it's the same, but that's how it is. And I'm thinking about in the future how I'm going to add varargs to my language. And so, of course, since my language is transpiled to C, I have to know how they work in C. And I haven't really, but now recently, I kind of have learned how they work more, so I figure I may as well make a video to try and explain it. So, something to know about varargs. You'll probably have always used a function like printf, which itself uses variable arguments. So, for example, you see when I do this, and I just say printf of a string, I'm passing in no arguments here, which is totally okay. But suppose I want to print out a number, I can just do this, and suddenly this syntax works as well. And if you know C, you know that there is no function overloading. So what's going on here? This isn't like an overload of this function, it's just how printf is actually defined. You see here, there's this ... syntax, and that is varargs. So what that means is you can just pass in a ton of different arguments, theoretically infinite. I'm sure there's a practical limit in terms of memory or whatever, but you can pass in some variable number of arguments at runtime, and it will compile. So let's sort of construct how printf actually works. Although printf is a bit more confusing, but suppose we want to make our own function that is like printf. So let's just make a print. It's going to take a string, and it's like a format string, and then variable arguments. So how do we actually utilize this? And maybe what we want to do is eventually call printf. Now, unfortunately, we can't directly call printf using this vararg syntax, but we'll be able to do something else. So the first thing you do is you need to construct a VA list, which actually the very first thing you do is you have to include standard arg. And yep. And so we make a VA list, which is a type that's included in this header. And you'll just call it something like args or whatever. It doesn't really matter. And now what you have to do is you have to call VA start, and you have to give it the VA list of args. And then what you have to do is you have to give it the last name parameter. So, for example, you can't really do, in C, you can't really do something like func ... You see that it doesn't like that? Because the way that this works, it needs like a location in memory in this function. It needs the last name parameter here. There can be other parameters before this, it just needs to be the last one. Because I'm not sure exactly how this is implemented, and you don't really need to understand it. But these arguments, when you pass them in, are either going to be like in line in memory, or they're going to be in like subsequent registers. It doesn't really matter which is which. But basically, it just needs to know this is the previous argument, and everything after that is going to be a variable argument. Although, it doesn't know how many you passed in here, so that's up to you to manage. The way you usually would do that is you could pass in like a count right before, so that you know exactly how many of these you have. The way printf does it is, you notice, it can just count however many times you use like one of these string format specifiers using %. However many of these there are is how many variable arguments there are. So you don't necessarily need to put an account. And that's one of the things I really dislike about a lot of these tutorials. They always say, oh, well, you just make a count and then you have to point this to the count. But no, you don't point it to the count. You point it to whatever this last variable is. You can have plenty of other things here. It doesn't matter. What matters is this starts at the last parameter that is not variable. And then, of course, after you need to call VA end, and you give it the args. Now, again, I'm not sure exactly what this does, but it is important that you call VA end before you do a return in the function, because whatever this does, it's going to set up it's probably going to push around registers and pointers and stuff. And this has to undo that, because otherwise your whole thing is going to be messed up. Because the way C works is it's really just assembly. You just have a bunch of things in line, and then, you know, you have registers that have to be set and stuff like that. It kind of helps to drop the abstraction a little when you're using these, because this is such a, like, cobbled together syntax, honestly. But this is like the fundamental nature of it. You construct a list, you initialize that list using VA start, you give it the last name parameter here, and then at the end you end it. Now, if we want to just simply make this print work, what we have to do is we actually have to call vprintf, which is also in standard IO. And instead of, you see this printf is, it takes a format string and variable arguments with a dot dot dot, but vprintf takes the format string and a VA list. So we can just pass the format string and the args. And now if we just do print, I suppose I have to compile this, and we do /a.out, it prints the new line. And let's make that a bit clearer. Let's actually do something else, like this. A.out. And you see it prints exactly like printf, because fundamentally this, what we've created, is essentially just an interface to that. Now, suppose you actually want to use your arguments. Let's do something else this time. Let's make a function that will return the sum of an int. I suppose int sum is probably better, because eventually we're going to do something else. So int sum, and what we want is, it needs to take in the number of things you have, plus dot dot dot. And again, like I said, there just needs to be a parameter here to initialize it, and you have to know how many there are. So what we can do here is we create a VA list args. I guess I can get rid of that print statement now. VA start, we can initialize this args using the count, and we have to end it. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to return the sum of an arbitrary number of ints. I'm not sure if it matters where, like, if I do my sum here, I don't know if that matters that it happens before. It might not. I'm not certain on that. I probably should have looked ahead of time, but I'm guessing it doesn't, but it might. I don't know. I don't think so. It's just, when you're using things like this, it's important to remember, because yeah, these are like, this isn't a function, this is a macro, so this can do all sorts of wild stuff. But just remember to call end before you return control flow to wherever it came from, so that everything is set up again. But so we can just do our function in here, and what we want to do is, for like just a simple loop, I is less than count. Now we can go through and we can actually get all of these. And we can say sum plus equals VA arg, and you give it the args and you give it the type. So that's how printf allows you to have different types all in a row, because you don't have to call it with the same type every time. In this case, we're going to, but you don't have to. So actually, we could have made this, you know, something more complicated, and we could have taken different types of numbers. But what matters is you know which is which. That's the important part, because otherwise you're going to run into issues. And so now let me try to run this. This might not work as is, because I did have trouble with VA arg before, but this is essentially what you do to grab the next argument. I want to just printf the sum, and it's going to be int sum of, pass in 3 numbers. Always remember to have that count. And let's do 5. Let's just do 3 5s. Which I suppose doesn't actually showcase what it's doing. So let's do something like this. And 5 plus 1 plus 2 is in fact 8. So you see, that's how that works. Now there's one other thing you can do with VAs. Literally, I think that is only one other thing you can do. Suppose you want another function, and you want to pass along the variable arguments the way that we did before with printf. What you can do is you can say, you can make another VA list, args2, and then you can say VA copy, and the destination is args2 and args. So this is just if you want to make a copy of your VA list before you start messing around with it. So, like, I'm pretty sure, for example, if you copy this up here, before you access the args, then it will just be the exact same as it was initially. Because the important thing to notice here is that every time you call VA arg, the state of this args variable changes. What I'm guessing it does is it essentially, it's just like a big just the way I'm thinking about this is it's like a big list of memory. It's just a big hunk of memory. And when you call VA arg, it has an internal sort of pointer in that memory somewhere. And when you say int, it's saying, okay, let's just move this pointer by like size of int. And we'll give whatever the result of that was. That's how I'm internalizing how this works. If you call VA arg when there isn't an argument left, that's undefined behavior. Anything could happen. So that's why you need to keep track of how many there are, because it doesn't know how many there are at runtime. You have to figure that out some way. You can be clever about it. You don't just have to do this. But yeah. So there's another thing we can do. VA list. I can get rid of this copy. And unfortunately, I don't think there's a way to go from a VA list back to this syntax. So you noticed when we made the print function, we had to pass in the actual like args into this. We couldn't just like do something in Python where we could just like unpack that. I don't think there's any way around that. So once you go into a VA list, I think you're just stuck there unless you can be clever about it, or maybe hacky about it even. So there's one other thing we can do, and let's make a double sum, which is kind of redundant, I'll admit, because you really could just do two separately. But essentially, let's just do this exact same thing, except we're going to be using doubles. And there is a reason for this. I'll show you in a moment. We'll do this sum, comma, LF. And then we can do double sum. I suppose this isn't going to be exactly how I want it. I think what we can do, let's just be hacky about it and give the count in terms of a double. And that should be fine. And what I'll do just to guarantee is I'll cast this to an int, which I don't think I really need to do, but it should work, I think. It'll probably, because what I'm going to try to do is showcase how you can use varargs in a macro instead of just a function. So suppose first I need to say, let's say 3 arguments, and it's like 2.2, 1.1, 1.4, just very sort of basic. 7.7, 4, 5, 6, yeah, 7.7, that seems about right. So that should be working. I'm not certain about this less than the double value, but that should be okay. And I should pass this in specifically as a double, 3.0. And now what we can do is we can come along here and we can say hash define sum, which is why I called those things, and it should be a sum of an x, well, like a count, and a variable number of arguments. And we can then use a hash generic with the count in here. I'll use parentheses like this because I think it should work just fine and it's in principle safer. But so you can do a generic of this, and if the count is an int, then we call int sum with the count and the varargs. And so how you access, let me just put this on a new line. How you access the varargs in here is you do this, va args underscore, and that will pass all of these in. Now there's one thing you probably want to be careful of. Notice before, if we called int sum of just a count and the count was 0, nothing would happen. It would just return sum as 0, which is good. That's what we would want to happen. But the issue is here, this is just a preprocessor thing, right? It's just going to copy paste this. So what we want is to do this. And I'm pretty sure this should work even inside a generic. We'll have to test in a moment, but essentially what you do is when you're using varargs, often you will want to use this preprocessor operator. I believe it's the token concatenate operator, which is super useful, but specifically when you have a comma and you have the concatenation with vargs, if vargs is empty, it will remove the comma. That way you don't have a syntax error when you pass in nothing. That's essentially all that does. There's other ways to do it, but I think this is just the best way overall from what I've read. And now we can do a... Technically, we could do a default or double. I don't think I need a default. If I do, I'll come back and do that, but it'll be the exact same thing except double sum and vargs. And so instead of this, if we just replace these with sum, in principle, this will work. And it does exactly the same thing, except now we have a singular name. And we passed in we used the header or macro which I'm pointing this out because this is an important distinction. The preprocessor varargs are different than these varargs, but they work together in a good way. And I suppose to kind of show that point before, if I make this the sum of with 0 elements and I run it, you see there's no error. And if I remove this, you see already there's a problem here. It detects that when this is expanded, it's exactly like saying this, right? This is no different than if I just wrote this, which is a syntax error, which is why it was upset before. Which is why you just use this to get rid of the comma if there's nothing. But yeah, varargs are super useful in C. They're kind of a huge pain to set up, but they're not nearly as complicated as I initially thought they were. They're relatively simple. The only thing, like I said, to keep in mind is you can't go back to this syntax. So if you're making like functions that are useful for varargs, it might be good to make a V version, a V int sum, where instead of taking in this, you could take in a VA list of args, just so that you have that option, especially if you want to do recursive things. And I suppose I should actually showcase what that type of function would look like. So just real quick, suppose I make a V int sum with an int count, a VA list of args. Then what we can do is we can take all of this logic in here, and we can just return the sum. And then what we can do here is we can just call that vint sum with the count and our args, store the sum. Notice that we have to actually, I have to put this above. Notice that we have to store the sum because we have to call end before we return. But so now you could just do this, and you can have your logic in here. It looks pretty simple. But of course, you're still using this and the varargs. But now, any other function that already has varargs can just call vintsum and give it the arguments, or they can give a copy of the arguments using va-copy. So I hope that all of this makes sense to you, and that you've learned something and that it's interesting. If you have any questions about this, if I wasn't clear about anything, just let me know. There's not too much to it. It might be better off just, looking it up, but I think overall this was pretty useful and pretty good. It's definitely useful for me, so I hope you guys enjoyed. If you like videos like this, just let me know. Maybe I can make more of them. But otherwise, I will see you guys in the next episode, if there is a next episode of this series that isn't actually a series. But yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one.